And today, joining us, political and diplomatic reporter for the Times of Israel, Tal Schneider, senior fellow at the Kohelet Policy Forum, Professor Avi Bell, professor of law at the Bar-Ilan University and at the San Diego University, and former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Dr. Michael Oren, former deputy Israeli minister and parliament member. Hello, all, and thank you so very much for joining us tonight as our main topic. It's D-Day. But is it D for democracy or D for dooms? One D is for certain. It's a decisive one for Israel's past, present, and future. And before we get to our conversation, let's cross now live to our 24 News correspondent Hamda Salhout out in the anti-judicial overhaul protests in Jerusalem tonight outside the Israeli parliament. Hamda, what's happening?
Ellie, tens of thousands of demonstrators here in Jerusalem against the government's judicial overhaul reforms. Now, I'm going to step out of the frame, have our cameraman Ahmed Al-Alami show you some of the scene here. Now, we're talking about the reasonableness bill here. Opponents to this law, that being the coalition, are claiming that in Israel's judicial system, this doctrine's importance lies in that it gives the court ability to review potentially corrupt decisions or appointments that don't explicitly violate conflict of interest or other legal restrictions. Now, what the opposition, what these demonstrators here are saying is that abolishing this reasonableness clause will actually significantly reduce the number of judicial reviews that the government and its officials can make, that high court justices can intervene in extremely corrupt decisions that could even potentially violate human rights. So the clock is ticking at the Israeli parliament. Now these demonstrators are saying they're going to continue taking to the streets for the next 24 hours while the debate on the bill continues, and while the vote is tomorrow between the hours of 12 to 6. It will be a critical point in Israel's history on whether or not the coalition and the opposition will either come to an agreement or this bill will go through as is. But these demonstrators are saying that they're going to continue voicing their concerns until the bills are swapped. Ellie.
I-24 News correspondent Hamda Salhout out in Jerusalem. Thank you very much for this. Back with our panelists. Let's get to it. If the reasonableness bill passes, does it mean protest failed? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation from there. Tal Schneider, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Yeah, obviously, it's not about the protest failing or not. It's definitely about what the country is headed into. If this passes, then we are heading into something that is less of a democracy. And we definitely see other suggestions being put through by this government. So this is just the first portion. And we are, many people concerned that this country is heading into something that is less of democracy, less of the democracy that we've been used to.
Yes, uncharted territory, that's for certain. Professor Avi Bell, your thoughts?
It's actually well-charted territory. Israel is the only country in the world that has this kind of reasonableness doctrine in which the court can second-guess any kind of a decision by an elected official, and it's not had it forever. It's only had it since 1980, the reasonableness doctrine, the application to government decisions only since the 1990s. If this passes, it's the first step in a return to parliamentary democracy, the way it's practiced in the rest of the world, and that's a very good thing.
Well, uncharted territory in the sense of social cohesion or lack thereof, or maybe not even that. Last but not least, Dr. Michael Oren, your take.
For my years in Knesset, I was always working for judicial reform, and it was widely accepted by opposition and coalition politicians together that reform was absolutely necessary. And a compromise on this reform is also necessary and also achievable. The Histadrut Labor Federation put out a compromise yesterday. It was a good compromise, a way of limiting the scope of unreasonableness in the proceedings of the Supreme Court, and a way of also extending the period given to negotiation between the opposition and the coalition to reach a compromise on the outstanding issues. Both sides should accept the Histadrut proposal.
Okay, and on that note, lady, gentlemen, let's please feel free to interact, to engage in a conversation. Let's begin from the point Dr. Oren just made. Is the compromise outline really a compromise, Professor Bell?
I haven't seen the Histadrut proposal. I think that there are a lot of different compromise proposals that have been made so far. Some of them I've liked more, some of them I liked less. I don't think the issue is what's in the compromise as much as the question is whether the opposition is interested in a compromise. I think that right now they feel that these protests are succeeding at what they're supposed to do, which is to create chaos and potentially destabilize the government and bring about new elections. And until they feel that they're not going to work, that the protests are going nowhere, I don't think that there's any appetite in the opposition for compromise.
Tal Schneider, what do you think?
I think there is an appetite in the opposition for a compromise. Obviously, it served at least Gantz, it served him very well to be the person who is leading some sort of moderate positions. It served him in the polls. Doesn't mean that it's going to serve him in the election whenever those will take place. But we seen tonight even Yair Lapid coming to, with some soft terms or approaching this with a different, sense than he used to do in recent months. He sounds a little bit more easing, if you may call it like that. The only problem is that there is a big gap between the leaders of the opposition and the street. What we see in the streets is very different from what we see in the Knesset. Obviously, those demonstrations are not part of a political operation. They are, something of itself. And I don't know if those two, sides can sit together. I'm talking about the opposition leaders and the people in the street. They're not in accordance with everything.
And perhaps to that point, Dr. Oren, will it be the strike who cried wolf? Should the workers' union go nuclear, so to speak, or call a strike and risk it not working?
I don't think so this time. I think the history is going to exercise far more restraint than it did last time around when it declared that strike. But, Ellie, there's no ideal compromise. There's no ideal that's going to leave everybody satisfied, clearly. But there has to be a middle ground between the system that existed for the last 20, 30 years, in which the Supreme Court's jurisdiction was the widest in the world, and where the gap between the Knesset, which reflected public opinion, and the composition of the Supreme Court, which did not reflect public opinion, that gap grew wider and wider, was no longer sustainable. There has to be a middle position between a government proposal which essentially removes all effective judicial checks on government and an opposition to the government reforms which rejects all compromise of the status quo or reform the status quo entirely. Both sides are at polar opposites, and there has to be a middle ground, which again will not be acceptable to either side, not completely acceptable, but will be certainly better than a national breakdown.
So is it at this point in time perhaps more about face saving than the actual reform compromise, Dr. Oren?
I think it's about maneuverability in any negotiation. I participated in international negotiations. Both sides need some kind of wiggle room, some ability to climb down from their high ladders. My great distress here, Ellie, is I don't see that wiggle room here, where both sides have basically made it almost an existential zero-sum game, where neither can compromise without being labeled treasonous, traitors by their own camps.
Professor Bell.
I see the compromise problem differently. I think that the legislation as it came out originally was fairly open. That is, very few concrete bills were put on the table, and most of them were already compromise proposals. What you have here is a different dynamic. There was a judicial reform movement that was led by then Justice Minister Daniel Friedman, Professor Daniel Friedman, in 2006, and it was derailed simply by the state attorney dragging its feet for 3 years until the government fell and he was unable to do anything. And I think that the compromise talks that we've had so far haven't really been about compromise. They've been a way of the opposition trying to slow down the process. And I think that the most important thing to getting negotiations seriously going is something passing. At that point, it becomes clear that dragging your feet is not a possible strategy for winning, and both sides are going to have to come in and be ready to cut a deal.
Well, Tal Schneider, if passed, It's a catch-22, so to speak, for you here. Should or would the Supreme Court strike down the reasonableness bill?
Well, it's a big question. I mean, up until now, the Supreme Court made it clear that it doesn't take on basic laws. He actually, they left for themselves the option to do that in the future, but they haven't done it so far in, many years that they're being, when they're deliberating bills, they've never deliberated a basic law. So I find it problematic for them, and I find it problematic for the country. Having said so, this coalition or any coalition, they are, any kind of government, even in the past, before Bibi's time, they have changed the basic laws, every other day, using 61 majority. So they made the basic law to be something that is not part of a constitution, but actually just a name, just a tag name. You take a regular bill, you call it the basic law, and that's it. So they just downgraded the basic law to a point where, I don't know what Esther Hayut will do, but I do not find it surprising if she will say, yeah, this time she called it the castle did not fall, or this time the castle is falling, and I'm entering into this project dealing with the basic law for the first time in Israel's history. And if that is the case, then we will be facing such a constitutional crisis that, we haven't yet seen.
She's right. Oh boy, she's right, and I agree with also the downgrading, Tal, of the basic laws, which were intended to be a substitute for an actual constitution, have now been sort of a fill-in gap for various exigencies needed in the political system. We could face a situation like that, Ellie, where the Supreme Court will overturn the vitiation, the negation of unreasonable law, and then the army, the police, the security apparatus will have to choose to which body it will remain loyal, to the elected representatives of the Knesset or to the judges of the Supreme Court.
It sounds apocalyptic, and yet we could be just days away from this scenario Dr. Oren is describing, Professor Bell.
Not days away, not days away.
I have to say this is something that's been on the horizon for quite a while, and I have to say something first about it's not true that what we're looking at is downgrading the basic laws. The basic laws were from the beginning designed to be rough drafts that would be picked up at some future talks for a constitution. They were upgraded by the court itself for the purpose of giving the court power in 1992. Justice Barak discovered after the fact that the basic laws had been caught up in a constitutional revolution that gave the court power to overturn laws. And it's been expanding that power for itself over the years. Now, if the court now jumps in and uses powers that are unlimited that it created itself to strike down these laws, chaos is going to break out. And I'll say what's worse than that is when the court acts, unlike when the Knesset acts, there's no compromise. There's no future legislation to change things. When they give an order, people are going to have that stark choice, and I do think there is going to be shooting on the streets.
Okay, on that grim note, we are taking a quick break, but when we get back, we take you live to Tel Aviv, where the pro-judicial overhaul protest is taking place, and of course, continue to untangle this very tangled situation here in Israel. A few minutes, and we're back with the summit. Do not go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Professor Avi Bell, Tal Schneider, and Dr. Michael Oren. Thank you all so very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, I-24 News correspondent Nicole Tzedek is in Tel Aviv, where a mass pro-judicial overhaul protest is taking place as we speak. Nicole, what's happening there? What are the demonstrators saying?
Well, demonstrators out here say they want to make sure that their voice is heard. They say for the past several months, several weeks, this right here in the center of Tel Aviv has really been the epicenter of these protests against the judicial reform. However, tonight, it's a completely different situation, and we're seeing these protesters in support of the judicial reform, and they say they want to make sure they're coming out to make sure that their voices are heard and that the coalition knows that they have their support behind them. In fact, we're hearing reports tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of supporters of the judicial reform came out here to the streets of Tel Aviv tonight, really showing that as the coalition chooses to maybe move forward with this controversial legislation, they say they have their support from many, many people all throughout Israel. So right now, it's kind of controversial what we're hearing from the coalition, whether they are going to push through, because you hear all of these supporters out here urging them not to fall into the opposition's demand, not to fall into what they're saying is the vocal minority. However, on the other side of the spectrum, you have such prominent leaders in the military, in businesses, in medical field, all of them urging the coalition not to go through with the reform. So we're really hearing these protests on both sides of the spectrum, and what we're actually hearing inside the Knesset is we're seeing this divide as well, but no one wants to see everyone coming out here, and so it's going to be a hefty decision for the coalition and the government to decide what to do going forward.
Yes, and speaking to that point exactly, Nicole Tzedek, our 24 News correspondent, thank you so very much for this. Dear panelists, let's get to it. Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Is it at this point in time in the coalition's best interest to go forward with the legislation? Professor Avi Bell, please take the lead.
I'm going to do what I think Tal did earlier. I think that the important question is not whether it's in the coalition's interest. I think it's whether it's in the country's interest. I think that reasonableness is a real anomaly. It's a doctrine that doesn't belong in any sane legal system. I think that judicial reform is absolutely necessary to restore democracy in Israel, to restore the separation of powers. And I think that we can't let this get destroyed by foot dragging. I think it's important to go forward.
Dr. Michael Oren, your thoughts?
I think it's important to reform the judicial system, but it's also important to maintain the checks on government, on absolute government. And that's where the compromise has to come through. And I would strongly urge the government to take a deep breath and try one more time to reach a compromise with the opposition leaders. We owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our children to prevent to the best of our ability the bloodshed, which we all fear is coming in the coming days.
Tal Schneider, your thoughts?
Right, this bill that is up for tonight, it's actually in the wrong direction, taking the country into, stripping the courts from its authorities, and it's just the first step of a whole, scheme to get the Supreme Court to not be able to do anything in the country. And I think this is a very bad direction that the country is going. By the way, Netanyahu gave, promises to rating agency, to the United States president to do things in consensus, and he's not doing it. So this is bad enough as it is. What we're seeing right now.
And ladies, gentlemen, let's please feel free to interact, to engage in a conversation. And perhaps let's begin from the point Tal Schneider just made. It's not just Democrats anymore, not just the Biden administration. Former U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman, cannot be dismissed as a dove, so to speak, criticizing the legislation. A bunch of other former Israeli diplomats warning too. Professor Avi Bell, should Netanyahu pull the brakes for the sake of Israel's diplomatic standing?
I think that it would be a big mistake to stop the legislative process out of extortion. And that's, I think, what would be happening if we did it now. We're looking at really some red lines that should never have been crossed. People threatening never to join the army again, never to report for the army again, closing down hospitals, closing down universities, closing down airports, closing down highways. I receive death threats all the time these days. These are things that should not be happening. And I think that moving the legislative process forward is part of restoring sanity to Israel's relations with the world and restoring sanity to Israel's democracy.
Dr. Oren.
Well, I talk on a personal level. I spent many years working with the Prime Minister, and I know that he saw as his life mission, the reason for he was born was to save Israel from an Iranian nuclear program and an Iranian aggression. And I think it's the greatest travesty that instead of addressing that pending threat, the government is engaged in what is essentially a civil struggle that could tear this country apart and further endanger us. I think that we've lost sight of the ultimate goal of the state. States, which is to ensure Jewish survival and Jewish security, and that should be paramount. I don't think that people who are protesting are extortions, and I disagree with many of their tactics and some of their goals, but the main thing here is to maintain a sense of unity in the face of just the seemingly insurmountable challenge of Iranian nuclearization.
Tal Schneider.
Yeah, some of the reservists, the people who are doing military service in Israel, if you listen to them, they are saying they are very concerned from international courts suing them or arresting them all around the world. Now you may ignore that, but if you talk to the Attorney General, the former Attorney General Avi Mendelblit, he says that this process of prosecuting Israeli, officers or soldiers can happen very quickly. I mean, as of the following month, it can just start. International bodies. I mean, Netanyahu has said through the years that Israel courts are the shield, are the protectors of our officers. I mean, and I have here in my house, I have an officer a son that is an officer in the military, or parents, friends. They have really concerns. I mean, this is just one aspect of the problem. We have other aspects, obviously, of separation of powers and so on. But this is the shield. Netanyahu has said so himself for so many years, that the Supreme Court of Israel is the shield for our country. And what happened now? I mean, you are throwing away our shield for what? For reasonableness? For this, this very quick legislation that nobody understands what's the point? What do you want it for? Only for nominating people or dismissing the Attorney General, the current Attorney General? Doesn't make sense at all.
And yet, Tal, isn't it a slippery slope to an extent to condition showing up for duty based on ideological positions?
No, Ali, the slippery slope is this Yariv Levin package of bills that is turning the country into something that is a less of a democracy. I don't want to say dictatorship because we're not there, but definitely we're moving in a very bad, direction with respect to what the democracy values should be in Israel. And it's not those people who are demonstrating. They have served as pilots or as, cybersecurity expert under Likud government for so many years. They never resisted the Likud government. This is the first time they are, it's really out of control what they're saying.
Well, Professor Avi Bell, usually in our conversations, we are looking for the different voices to be heard, but I think that today we need to look for the common among you panelists. What could be a compromise, or at least a movement towards a compromise?
Let me just first say I've been working on the issue of defending Israeli soldiers, including myself, by the way, from legal processes for decades now. Anybody who says that the Supreme Court is a shield simply hasn't been paying any attention to what's been going on. There's been a process going on at the International Criminal Court for almost a decade. The idea that anybody, my name is not Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm worked on this issue. I'm telling you it is absolute nonsense. I've been saying it's nonsense for years. I think it's despicable that government lawyers are trying to grab more power by scaring people into thinking that unless the government lawyers have power, they're going to be prosecuted. It's not true. Now, I think it's also despicable to tell people that unless they give up parliamentary democracy, there will be no democracy here. There will be a dictatorship. Let's come back to reality. Stop trying to scare everyone. Stop these scare tactics, stop the extortion. Let's talk about how to reform.
Dr. Michael Oren, 10 seconds. Give us a silver lining.
Silver lining is that as chairman of a classified committee in Knesset, I can tell you that we dealt with the threat of international prosecution of Israeli soldiers, and it's a real threat, and the possibility of compromise is there.
Dr. Oren, Tal Schneider, Professor Avi Bell, thank you. 2 minutes and we're back. Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.